Oh, great. Yeah, thanks so much, Aaron, and thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming. It's wonderful opportunity. I wish I could be in person in Heidelberg, but yeah, at least it's great to be able to do this. So in my talk today, what I'm going to do is I want to look at how views of Japan around the world evolved during the period from the 1890s to the Second World War. And I'm going to focus especially on the figure of the samurai, on the kind of famous pre-modern warriors who became one of the most important symbols of Japan over the course of the early 20th century. You can see a group of reenactors dressed as samurai in the photograph that's in the background to this presentation. This photograph was taken in 1910. So it's almost 40 years after the abolition of the samurai class, which is, in and of itself, kind of significant for reasons that I'll go into, that this photograph is taken so much later. Another related concept that featured prominently during this time is Bushido, the way of the samurai or the way of the warrior, which is largely a product of the modern period rather than, an ancient ethic. And in this talk, I'm going to first discuss the development of the samurai and Bushido in Japan. I'll then look at the evolution of the samurai image in China during the decades before 1945. I'm then going to look at representations of the samurai in the United States before following up with the third and final section on kind of Britain and Europe. And I plan to talk for about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes in total, and then obviously happy to take questions. And I really look forward to any thoughts and feedback you may have. I should probably mention at the outset that the historical use sources that I'm using here, they include propaganda materials and caricatures from the early 20th century. And this includes obviously some images and terminology that some people may find offensive. Um, Now, I'd like to start my talk today in the 1850s. And at this point, Japan is ruled by the samurai. And unlike the background image, this studio photo may include some actual samurai. Now, samurai is the popular name for warriors that ruled Japan for almost 700 years until the 1860s. And while the samurai were fierce fighters for much of the medieval period, in 1600, Japan is unified under the Tokugawa shoguns and remains at peace for the next 250 years. And although the samurai, they remain warriors in name, for all practical purposes, they were administrators and bureaucrats. At this time, in the early modern period, a number of samurai started writing about what it was that made them special, trying to justify their positions, but there's very little consensus among them. And this is complicated by the fact that there's considerable diversity among samurai. Many of them are unemployed or just kind of scraping by. And by the early 19th century, it had become possible for commoners to purchase samurai status, and poorer samurai would also give samurai status up so as to allow them to pursue other professions and make a living. So, in short, kind of especially before 1600, when the samurai were warriors, they were not really concerned with ethics. And when they started writing about ethics and thinking about this more, they were not really warriors anymore. So when we think of a term like Bushido, this is not widely used before the 1890s, and there's not really any commonly accepted way of the samurai or way of the warrior under any other name either. So in 1853, an American fleet under Commodore Matthew Perry um, arrived in Japan. Oh, sorry, there we go. Which had been officially closed to the outside world for over 200 years at that point. The inability of the Tokugawa government to face the foreign threats led to considerable unrest and the ultimate collapse of the old order in 1868, when a few regional lords overthrew the government and placed the Meiji Emperor in power. I mean, emperors had continued to exist over the almost 800 years of samurai rule, but they were little more than figureheads, and many people were unaware of their existence. In spite of it being an ostensible return to tradition, which is known as the Meiji Restoration, the beginning of the Meiji period was defined by wholesale modernization and westernization processes that shook the whole country. But we can really see these in these two images of the Meiji Emperor. We have these two photographs, which are taken just a few months apart, 1872, 1873. And, we see him in very traditional dress in the first one, And then a few months later, he's photographed in kind of a modern European military uniform, and that's generally how he's depicted after that point. Now, students and experts were sent to the West to study at this time, while foreign advisors were brought in on such a large scale that their salaries threatened Japan's financial stability. One of the Meiji government's first priorities after 1868 was to establish a modern army, which relied on conscripts rather than samurai, and many of the samurai struggled to adapt to the new order. This presented a major problem, and proposed solutions to the samurai issue included invading Korea under a pretense in order to get the samurai out of the country and give them something to do. Uh, this plan was ultimately rejected, but it was taken very seriously at the highest levels, showing the degree of concern with the samurai problem. As many samurai feared, the abolition of the old warrior government was followed by the gradual elimination of samurai stipends and their special status, including the privilege of wearing swords, in a series of reforms in the 1870s. Their discontent was a significant factor in a number of disturbances that shook Japan at the time. The most famous of these uprisings occurs in 1877, when a large number of former samurai gathered around the restoration hero Saigo Takamori and instigated a rebellion that the new government could only put down with great loss of life. The violence of this rebellion further demonstrated the gap that had developed between mainstream society and the former samurai who had been left behind. Popular sentiments towards the samurai in the 1880s were conflicted and often negative. Based on his experiences in Japan in the 1870s, the educator William Elliot Griffiths wrote of the recent past that the majority of samurai spent their life in eating, smoking, and lounging in tea houses, or led a wild life of crime in one of the great cities. When too deeply in debt or having committed a crime, they left their homes and the service of their masters and roamed at large. So, Griffith's description of the samurai as violent loafers and a burden on society may have been an overstatement, but it reflected widely held negative views of the samurai in Japan at the time. By the 1880s, many people criticized samurai behavior, or more commonly, just dismissed it as a relic of a bygone age. Even as late as 1894, negative assessments of the samurai continued to hold sway, as we can see reflected in David Murray's The Story of Japan, where he writes, the samurai were left penniless and helpless. The traditions under which they had been trained led them to look down upon labor and trade with disdain, and rendered them unfit to enter successfully on the careers of modern life. In many cases, worry and disappointment, and in others, poverty and want, have been the sequels which followed the poor and obsolete samurai. So, in this situation, the idea that a way of the samurai, even if such an ethic had existed before, could benefit the new Japan would certainly have seemed old fashioned and strange. Now, at the same time that the samurai legacy was being cast aside, Japanese elites were becoming increasingly interested in Europe's medieval past, also through the Victorian history textbooks that formed the basis of much of the new Japanese education system, and which were full of references to knighthood and the Crusades. In the 1870s and 1880s, as many Japanese rejected their own feudal heritage and sought to modernize, the Victorian chivalric revival in Europe, especially Britain, complicated things. From the Japanese perspective, on the one hand, the British Empire was the world's most powerful empire and built on the most modern technology. On the other hand, the British were fascinated by medieval culture and traced their own rise to medieval ideals. Above all, the English gentleman, depicted here in Japanese prints, was seen as the heir of medieval knighthood and chivalry, defending national virtues that had been passed down through the centuries. Now, by the late 1880s, Japanese attitudes towards the past had begun to shift, and most Japanese no longer had meaningful memories of the samurai order, making possible a symbolic rehabilitation of the samurai and other feudal symbols. Japanese writers were heavily influenced by idealized notions of English gentlemanship as the basis for the strength of the British Empire, and they typically accepted the links that were drawn between medieval knights and modern gentlemen. Inspired by these dynamics, Japanese thinkers around 1890 proposed that, like England, Japan had also had a feudal knighthood the samurai, which could serve as a reference for a native chivalry, which they called Bushido, and which was portrayed as the very soul of Japan. Bushido was popularly outlined as an ethic of honesty, integrity, and self sacrifice, echoing some key values of idealized English gentlemen, which would also have been recognizable to those with a traditional Confucian education, as many people in Japan had experienced. Now, this was part of a process by which Japanese rediscovered their own medieval past as a source for modern national identity. Castles, which were associated with the samurai and had been torn down on a large scale in the 1870s, were increasingly preserved and celebrated, and dozens of castles were converted to modern army bases. Through Bushido and castles, medieval symbols were linked to the modern state, and especially the modern military that was seen as the heirs of the samurai warriors. This connection developed rapidly after Japan's victory over China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and this also rapidly changed British views towards Japan and the samurai. An overview of this war published in the graphic stated that the strategy and fighting powers of the Japanese have distinctly surprised Europe in the present campaign. Yet, after all, the Japanese are a martial race by heredity and training. In ancient days, the feudal system developed regular military service, and in modern times, the old samurai spirit is only hidden under apparent civilization. So the samurai came to be seen as a positive heritage of medieval Japan, and British commentators increasingly invoked them to explain various aspects of Japanese politics, culture, and society. Now, idealistic views of the samurai and Japan spread even more widely throughout British society following the signing of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, and Bushido became a household word in Britain and around the world after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. This event shocked the world and has been referred to by some historians as World War Zero. This was the first war in which a non-Western nation defeated one of the great powers, and it inspired people throughout Asia and Africa. In Europe and America, it also fed emerging fears about a yellow peril that were growing at the time, and Japan's victory met with many racist responses. For both supporters and critics of Japan, however, Bushido and the samurai spirit were seen as the reasons for Japan's victory. A milestone in the international profile of Bushido and the samurai was the publication of Nitobe Inazo's book Bushido, the Soul of Japan, in English in 1900, and this soon became a bestseller. Nitobe's Bushido incorporated significant aspects of contemporary English notions of gentlemanship, such as an emphasis on fair play, compassion for the weak, and an independent spirit. It was natural that these more Western interpretations of Bushido resonated among Western readers and became the most popular outside of Japan. I will return to Nitobe later, as he continues to have a great influence on popular understandings of Bushido and the samurai around the world, but here I would like to focus on the fact that Nitobe's specific theories were largely dismissed within Japan until well after the Second World War. Within Japan, it was one of Nitobe's greatest critics whose views were far more significant, and this was Inoue Tetsujiro, who referred to himself as the greatest philosopher east of Suez. As professor of philosophy at Tokyo Imperial University, Inoue had tremendous influence and was the undoubted primate of Bushido discourse from 1901 until 1945. Inoue first discussed Bushido in a lecture at the Officers Training School in 1901 and initiated a pattern of cooperation between military and civilian education institutions that would last through the end of the Second World War. Now, Inoue's writings on Bushido, and few of these have been translated, were significant not only because of their wide dissemination, but also because of several elements he introduced. One of these was a focus on loyalty to the emperor, which became the core tenet of what I call Imperial Bushido, which became a prominent ideology from 1905 to 1945. Through government support and legitimization by Inoue and other official figures, the Imperial Bushido ideology became firmly established in military and civilian education in order to indoctrinate people with the desired virtues of loyalty and self-sacrifice. At the same time, Some interpretations of Imperial Bushido changed its emphasis from a pseudo historical way of the samurai to a more transcendental way of the warrior that could be traced back to Japan's divine origins. Now, by 1912, Japanese public life was saturated with Bushido, and there were few Japanese or foreigners interested in Japan who had not heard of Bushido and did not have a general idea of its meaning. Trends at the time of the Meiji Emperor's death in 1912 indicated that Bushido would continue to expand its reach, but this was not to be the case. Bushido experienced a sudden decline around 1914, which was closely tied to the end of Meiji and specifically the dramatic suicide of General Nogi Maresuke and his wife Shizuko on the day of the emperor's funeral. Nogi had been known as the flower of Bushido and epitomized the ethic in the popular opinion. However, his death shocked many Japanese and was seen as anachronistic, even if it was noble. Many eulogies of Nogi followed in 1913 and 1914, but there was also significant criticism of his suicide, and many claimed to be embarrassed by it in front of the world. Many people desired to move on from Meiji, and Nogi and Bushido were left behind and disappeared from much of popular culture. Now, while Bushido lost its popular appeal around the time of the First World War, it had become established in the education system and retained its presence and legitimacy as a historical ethic in the minds of most Japanese and as well as people abroad. In the 1930s, this high degree of recognition allowed Bushido to rapidly become a key component of legitimizing ideology of the imperial state. Discussions of Bushido can be found in many important propaganda texts from the time. It's important to note that the Japanese military did not have the resources of the Americans or the British, and ideological indoctrination was seen as a cheaper and more effective way of competing with the other great powers. Nationalistic and militaristic texts on Bushido by university professors went through millions of printings, while specially edited versions of samurai texts were given to soldiers. These were carefully selected to focus on loyalty and self-sacrifice, and were detached from their historical contexts. However, the production of large amounts of propaganda does not necessarily tell us a great deal about its reception, and there are significant questions as to the effectiveness of various aspects of the ideological indoctrination in Imperial Japan. And here I would like to highlight just two aspects for consideration. One is that Bushido was only one of several competing ideologies, even if it often featured in combination with others. Loyalty to the emperor was the most important ideology, and others were necessarily subservient to this. The other related aspect is that there was always an uneasy tension between samurai and the imperial house. There were very few examples of samurai loyalty to the emperor, and for most of the centuries of samurai rule, emperors were treated essentially as symbols, but with little autonomy. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, only a small proportion of the population were samurai before the 1870s, and the majority of Japanese would not have identified with the former warriors. The events during and after Japan's surrender in 1945 also suggest that Imperial Bushido may have had limited acceptance in the larger population, in spite of its prominence in various propaganda materials. Instead, I would suggest that the samurai and Bushido were at least as important in other countries as they were in Japan, and in some ways more so. Even if people in Japan did not necessarily identify closely with the samurai in the early 20th century, if ever, the samurai were an important symbol for people in other countries attempting to understand Japan. This was especially true in the case of military and political alliances or conflicts, when Japan's military capability was very often tied to a supposed samurai legacy. And now, by understanding Bushido as a malleable concept that can be applied to a variety of ends, it is possible to trace changes in modern nationalism, as well as shifts in popular attitudes towards Japan in other countries. Outside Japan, interest in Bushido has been predicated primarily by geopolitical developments, and the content and popularity of foreign Bushido theories can serve as a useful barometer of foreign views of Japan, as well as a gauge of critical internal attitudes within certain societies. Foreign Bushido theories have often been formulated independent of domestic Japanese discourse on the subject, with Japan serving as an abstract foil for addressing issues that may not be directly related to it. Bushido has found widespread use among foreign commentators seeking to understand Japan, with the samurai spirit credited at various times for Japan's economic success, technological progress, and military actions. So I'd now like to move um, away from Japan a bit and talk about kind of samurai and the view of the samurai and Bushido in China, where perhaps the most long-lasting and diverse discourse on these topics outside of Japan really has taken place in China and continues to do so today. From the late 19th century, the samurai have played an important role in shaping popular views of Japan, and they have been mobilized by thinkers of all political colors. As I mentioned before, I mean, the Japan's victory over China in 1895 is a major event, and it was widely seen as a demonstration of the more successful implementation of Western reforms and technology by Japan relative to China. The images from the war, especially in Japan, portrayed Japan's military in Western ways, as opposed to kind of garish and colorful Oriental Chinese troops, and superior modern military drill was widely credited with deciding the war in Japan's favor. The views of the samurai that emerged around the time of the war were not ostensibly militaristic, but they instead focused on virtues such as nationalism, diligence, and duty, which are seen as having given Japan the ability to adapt to modern military methods. The first writings by Chinese authors on Bushido appeared early in the development of discourse in Japan, reflecting the great number of Chinese students and reformers who spent time in Japan from the late 1890s onward. One of the first significant texts on the subject was written by the reformer Liang Qichao, who fled to Japan in 1898 after the failure of the Hundred Days Reform. By this point, Bushido was becoming known in elite discourse, and Liang published an article in 1899 titled, What of the Spirit of China? Um, And in this article, Liang first extolled the virtues of Bushido and its influence on the Japanese national spirit, calling upon his countrymen to adopt a similar national consciousness that would enable them to reform and strengthen the country. In Liang's estimation, Bushido was not specifically limited to Japan and could be planted to other societies, especially China. So you can see in the quote there is a great focus on Bushido here in 1899. Now, the culmination of Liang's interest in Bushido was actually the 1904 publication of his book China's Bushido, or Zhongguo Zhiru Dao, a book in which he argued for a native Chinese martial spirit, but consciously used the Japanese term. After reiterating the popular belief that Japan was a militaristic culture relative to China's more literature focused civilization, Liang stated that China had also had a storied Bushido or Wushidao tradition that it could call upon to strengthen the nation in this time of crisis. To this end, Liang cited examples from Chinese history to demonstrate the nation's own Bushido, beginning with the military character of the unification processes in ancient China that brought the country together from 10,000 states to a single one. Liang Qichao was already an established and influential figure in China during his time in Japan, and his writings on samurai and Bushido were very much in line with the still vague and developing Japanese intellectual discourse on the subject. In contrast, other, younger Chinese who had been sent to Japan to study after the Sino-Japanese War were exposed to Bushido in a similar way to Japanese students and cadets, i.e., that this was an ancient spirit unique to Japan. For this younger generation, the historical legitimacy of Bushido was never in doubt. And although aspects could be adopted and adapted for the Chinese situation, the concept would serve primarily as a vehicle for understanding Japan. Chinese writings on Bushido increased after the First World War, when Japan became firmly established as the major foreign source of political and military interference in China, but also as the greatest hope for potential aid for various factions. The influence of geopolitical developments on Chinese interpretations of Bushido was most apparent in the works of Daiji Tao, a member of the Nationalist Central Executive Committee and the government's information minister. And Dai had traveled to Japan to study at the age of 15 in 1905, returning to China in 1909 after obtaining a university degree. He had an excellent command of Japanese, and he became Sun Yat sen's translator and secretary, which gave him great influence even after Sun's death. Dai moved frequently between China and Japan, and his views on Japan were highly influential in his homeland. Dai's first significant text in this context, a 1919 essay titled My View of Japan, 我的日本观, criticized Japan's aggressive policy towards China while warning his countrymen that irrational hatred of the Japanese and rejection of Japan's successful policies would be a grave mistake. One of Dai's primary criticisms of Japan was the widespread use of force, which dominated the feudal period before Meiji. Dai criticized the cruel and exploitative nature of the samurai class, contrasting this with peace-loving Chinese society. According to Dai, it was only after Confucianism became influential during the Edo period that the violent character of Japanese society was tamed and the country began to build the foundation of its modern civilization, as he called it. Dai's focus on negative aspects of Japanese militarism reflected the growing anti-Japanese sentiments in China, but he also believed that Japan was changing and relations between the two countries could be beneficial in the long term. In 1927, Japan's involvement with China was becoming increasing or considerably more intrusive, but Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, and other right-wing members of the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, believed that Russian influence was the greater threat. So Dai was sent to Japan to solicit Japanese aid against the communists and to persuade the Japanese business community the Kuomintang's priority was to protect business interests. Upon his return to China, following the anti-communist purges in Shanghai, Dai returned to his 1919 essay and expanded it into a full-length book titled On Japan, or Rubenlun, which is the book that we're shown here on the right. And in this book, Dai took a more positive view of the samurai, crediting their Bushido spirit with having driven the Meiji Restoration. Bushido, combined with European political and revolutionary thoughts, Dai wrote, was a key to Japan's success in modernizing. In this work, Dai brought together two nascent themes from his earlier work, arguing that the adoption of Chinese thought in the Tokugawa period had combined to create a unique and powerful spirit that contained the best of both societies. Now, the samurai and Bushido had a strong and lasting impact in Chinese military education, as many leading officers had undergone training in Japan's military academies. For example, the military educator Jiang Baili graduated at the top of his class at the Japanese Imperial Military Academy and wrote in 1903 that Japan's success was due to its ability of combining the Bushido tradition with modern science, channeling the strength of both East and West. After returning to China, Jiang became head of the Baoding Military Academy, but after the disillusionment of the 21 demands imposed upon China by Japan in 1915, he dismissed Bushido as a possible instrument for use in China. Other military figures held on to the ideology, however, such as Chen Cheng, the future premier of the Republic of China, who decreed that cadets of the military academies memorize large sections of Yang Qichao's Bushido texts. Several Republican and other military figures in China also held on to the Bushido ideology even into the 1930s and beyond, actually. Yan Qishan, another graduate of the Japanese Imperial Military Academy and a powerful warlord, authored a pamphlet in the 1930s arguing that the adoption of Bushido was the only hope for China to resist the advance of the Japanese military. Even in 1938, only 1 year after the full-scale invasion of China by Japan began, Yen stated that only 70 years ago, Japan was still a small and weak country that was periodically subject to invasion, and the Meiji Emperor knew that a restoration was necessary. His restoration especially emphasized the military and proclaimed the Bushido spirit. According to Yen, the thousands of years of traditional Bushido spirit education are demonstrated by the fact that Japanese soldiers do not become prisoners of war, a trope that was first popularly associated with Bushido during his stay in 1904. And so, even during the height of the Sino Japanese conflict in the 1930s and 40s, the notion that Bushido could benefit China was promoted by prominent figures in the Republican government. Yen's longtime rival and ally, Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, had a similar exposure to Bushido during military training in Japan in the last years of the Qing dynasty, so the 1900s. And like Yen, Jiang was deeply impressed by the Bushido in Japanese military spiritual education and later sought to instill a similar spirit of loyalty and self sacrifice in his own men at the Huangpu Military Academy. After the Manchurian incident, Jiang expressed concern that Japan's greatest and most destructive weapon in the invasion of China was not a physical weapon, but the mental spirit of their troops. This spirit, Jiang claimed, was the Bushido spirit comprised of imperial loyalty, patriotism, disregard of death, and a fondness for war. Now, these sentiments would have been reinforced by Japanese military activities, such as supplying their officers with new swords modeled on samurai swords, and building their headquarters building in Manchukuo in the shape of a Japanese castle, which is what a lot of the military bases in Japan were occupying. Incidentally, this building is now used by the Chinese Communist Party, which is a slightly different purpose than I think the Japanese had originally intended. Now, naturally, criticism of Bushido was also widespread in China, especially in public discourse and among more left-leaning intellectuals. The writer Zhou Zuoren, for example, saw Bushido as causing problems not only for China in the context of Japanese aggression in the 1930s, but also as a root of trouble in Japan. According to Zhou, Bushido had indeed driven the beneficial change behind the Meiji Restoration, but it was also at the root of internal violence, such as the young officers who were terrorizing the nation with their assassination campaigns against politicians and industrialists in the 1930s in Japan. Neither Zhou nor other Chinese writers questioned the historical legitimacy of Bushido, but he insinuated that it had been corrupted and deviated from its honorable origins. Now, whether they were portrayed as positive or negative, influential Chinese thinkers held up the samurai and Bushido as representative of Japanese culture and society, and this trend continues into the 21st century. Now, I now want to move over to the other side of the Pacific Ocean to look at some of the influences of the samurai image and Bushido in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And I mean, many Americans were familiar with the samurai since at least 1860, when the first Japanese mission visited the United States. Natalia Doan has recently examined the extensive reporting on this mission in the American press at the time. And in the following decades, many Japanese farmers and laborers began emigrating to Hawaii and then the United States, the continental United States, which annexed Hawaii in the 1890s. According to one estimate, roughly 400,000 people emigrated from Japan to the United States and US controlled lands between 1886 and 1908. The vast majority of these arrivals were men looking for work and settled in Hawaii and the west coast of the United States. There, they encountered considerable prejudice and anti Asian racism, with immigration a fiercely debated political issue. For most of the early period of Japanese immigration in the early 19th century, the Japanese samurai image, or the samurai image, does not seem to have been especially relevant, nor would it have been immediately recognizable to most Americans. As elsewhere, this began to change after the Sino Japanese War, and then especially after the Russo Japanese War. Now, one Japanese individual who spent a great deal of time in the United States was Nitobe Inazo, who wrote Bushido, the Soul of Japan, during a stay in the United States in the late 1890s. For Nitobe, his main stated aim in writing the book was to explain Japanese society and culture to Westerners, and his distillation of this into the samurai spirit was simple and convincing to most American readers. Nitobe's work fed into growing interest in Japan after the Sino-Japanese War and the Boxer Rebellion, in which Japan was allied with the Western empires. Japanese martial abilities were highly esteemed, and the early 1900s saw a boom in jiu-jitsu around the world. President Teddy Roosevelt and his daughter were just two of the many students of the popular martial art. Roosevelt also promoted Nitobe's work during the Russo-Japanese War, supposedly buying 50 copies of his book to give to friends and family. This was especially significant as Roosevelt and American pressure were instrumental in making the Russians kind of end the war on terms favorable to the Japanese, and the peace treaty was signed at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in the United States. Through these various dynamics, the Russo-Japanese War firmly cemented the image of the samurai as the essence of the Japanese national character in the American mind. This essentializing stereotype had various effects over the following decades. It often led to a positive view of Japanese as loyal, honorable, chivalrous, and other attributes celebrated by Nitobe. A letter to the editor of the Hawaiian Japanese American newspaper in 1912, this newspaper in 1912 is representative, where he writes, "Dear Sir, every businessman who has lived in Hawaii for the past 15 years must truthfully state that the Japanese residents have contributed more to the upbuilding of Hawaii than any other nationality. Without the thousands of faithful Japanese laborers in the cane fields, in the sugar mills, and in every department of our great industry, it would have been impossible to bring this country to its present state of importance and prosperity. To the older Japanese subjects who have come to live in Hawaii, I send my greetings and beg that they inspire their younger generation with the spirit of the old samurai so that the country of their adoption may have loyal citizens. To the Hawaiian born children of Japanese parents, I offer the greetings of a fellow citizen and express the hope that they may undertake their duties as citizens moved by the ancient Bushido, which inspired their ancestors of long forgotten centuries." And so this is from a white American lawyer in Hawaii. Now, at the same time, the apparent strength of Japan, as demonstrated by victory over Russia, also fed into fears concerning Asia, as in the racist Yellow Peril discourses that began to grow in influence in the 1890s. Now, in this context, there were concerns in parts of Europe, the United States, and elsewhere that Japan could become the leader of Asia and challenge the Western empires for supremacy. The identification of Japanese people with the samurai contributed to this narrative by portraying them as others with completely different mindset and morality than Westerners. This is ironic in that Nitobe Inazo's stated aim in writing on Bushido was to show that Japanese were in fact fundamentally the same as Westerners and should be treated equally. Now, the issues surrounding samurai identity were especially complex for Japanese Americans, who were often caught between the two cultures, with Bushido often held up as an important value that connected them with Japan. Bushido often fed into debates on citizenship and identity, as can be seen in this 1921 article from Honolulu discussing the visit of the Japanese Christian socialist and educator Abe Iso. Now, you see the title here, Renounce Japanese Citizenship and Uphold America, is message of Professor Abe to American-born Japanese here. He then says, and he writes, "I would like to see every Japanese man and woman born in the United States renounce his Japanese citizenship, offer his undivided allegiance to America, and, when necessity arises, fight America's foes, even if the foe happen to be Japan." This is the message of Professor Abe, a member of the faculty of Waseda University, to American-born Japanese, majority of whom are dual citizens under the conflicting laws of Japan and the United States. Abandonment of the Japanese citizenship in favor of American citizenship is consistent with the principle and spirit of Bushido that guide the Japanese people, Professor Abe declared to a group of young men who gathered to hear him the other night. Now, the tensions are also reflected, or these tensions faced by Japanese Americans are also reflected in one of the first Japanese manga, which is produced by Henry Kiyama in the 1920s, and it's about his first 2 decades as an immigrant in America. And in a series of panels, which I've abridged, I've condensed. There are originally 12 panels in this series. The Japanese immigrant Charlie joins the US military to fight in the First World War in Europe with the expectation that he would be given citizenship thereafter. Hiyama depicts Charlie with a samurai sword, which he wields against the German enemy. When he returns, he then requests his US citizenship, but is told that it is not for Orientals yet. Here we see both the identification with the samurai, but as well as a desire to kind of become American, and kind of the racist policies that that runs into. I mean, as an aside, if anyone isn't familiar with this book, I really recommend it. Schutz's translation is excellent. It's a great teaching resource as well. Um, Now, moving ahead from this into the 1930s and 1940s, I want to focus on mainstream and official American views of the samurai, as tensions with Japan increased. I mean, certainly Japanese Americans continued to discuss the significance of samurai and Bushido, and they remained important symbols. I mean, one interesting example of kind of samurai related architecture is the Makiki Christian Church built in Honolulu in 1931 in the shape of a Japanese castle, which was quite controversial at the time and interpreted in different ways by different groups, either as a symbol of security or of feudal militarism, which kind of shows the complexity of this imagery. The church was expanded in 1936, and it remains a really impressive building today. One other area that I'm still working on is the devastating internment of the more than 100,000 Japanese Americans by the US government after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the role that Bushido and the samurai image played in various aspects of this. Now, I don't have the scope to go into the internment here, but I'd like to look at another aspect of US government policy related to Bushido and the samurai. And this concerns the war between the United States and Japan in the Pacific, as US military tactics were predicated on the belief that Japanese soldiers would never surrender, and that any apparent attempt by them to do so must certainly be a trap. The brutal American response, in turn, seemed to justify Japanese propaganda claims that Americans would torture and kill any POWs, making surrender futile. And this essentially resulted in a vicious circle of brutality in the Pacific War and a terrible number of casualties among Japanese troops, especially. And I mean, I've elsewhere kind of questioned the extent to which samurai centered ideologies in Japanese military education and training were effective, and whether many of the terrible and tragic events that occurred in the war were down to other factors. The disconnect between Japanese and American views, and also the connections, can be seen in the famous propaganda film Know Your Enemy, Japan, which is commissioned by the US War Department and produced under the direction of Frank Capra. I mean, ideally, I would just show this, or at least 8 minutes of it. It's an hour-long film. I really recommend people go look at it if you haven't seen it. Now, although the film was ultimately only completed at the end of the war, it's commissioned much earlier, its content is significant. And in this film, Capra edited together actual Japanese propaganda films to supposedly show how Japanese thought and acted, when these materials in fact merely reflected how the Japanese government desired that its citizens would feel and behave. Much of the focus was on emperor worship and the modern military, as well as civilians doing military drill. And I mean, that would be, for an example, is that, the film is saying, well, the Japanese are, they all worship the emperor. They're, loyal to the death to the emperor, and that's all they're focused on is serving the emperor. That's what the Japanese propaganda would say, and that's also what the US government would say. It has nothing to do with what the Japanese people are actually thinking. Um, Now, an interesting thing about Know Your Enemy is, which I wanted to pick up here, is that it contains a substantial amount of samurai related content that reflects American expectations more than anything else. And it's quite significant that this footage is either taken from popular samurai films, or it's newly created by the producers of the film, or it's taken from popular samurai films rather than the Japanese propaganda materials. Because the Japanese propaganda materials did not feature as much of the samurai imagery as sought by the American filmmakers and the US government. I'm just clicking through a few stills of this of the film so you get a bit of a sense of it. And apologies for the poor quality of the screenshots, but you can see a lot of these things are taken from popular samurai films in Japan. These are not from Japanese propaganda films. Um, and as if we kind of looked at a few of these old samurai films, samurai, attacking at war, at the battlefield there. And as this still here suggests, one of the main aims of the film is to show the samurai spirit that is supposedly behind the modern Japanese soldier. We see the kind of samurai in the background, the modern soldier out front. Um, as the narrator says later in the film over footage of a sword being forged, quote, as the steel is shaped by beating and hammering, so is the boy beaten and hammered into the shape of the fanatic samurai. End of quote. So Capra's use of the different types of media, including both official propaganda films and popular period films, suggests that during the Second World War, samurai symbolism was in some ways more important to Japan's enemies than it was to the Japanese government or people. Now, finally, I would like to just touch briefly on a few elements of the European situation in the early 20th century with regard to the samurai image. And I'm not going to go into this in much depth, but I wanted to just try to direct you to some of the excellent existing scholarship in the area at the end as well, because there's been quite a bit of work done on this. With regard to views of the samurai in Britain, these underwent significant changes from the 1860s to the Second World War. I mean, as I mentioned before, the many of the early Japanese embassies to the West were made up of samurai. They brought swords and armor as diplomatic gifts, as we can see here in the Tower of London. British reactions to the Russo-Japanese War were much more positive than they were in the United States, partly because of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, and partly because Japanese immigration was also not a significant issue for Britain itself. Although anti-Asian racism was becoming more prevalent in Australia, Canada, and other parts of the empire. Um, Pro-Japanese sentiment in Britain was reflected in works such as H.G. Wells' novel A Modern Utopia, in which an idealized samurai class rule atop a model society. And I mean, I'd especially recommend recent work by Chika Tonooka on this period, and I'll have a reference later. Now, what I'd like to very briefly do is just use the satirical magazine Punch to show one example of how the image of Japan in Britain evolved over the course of the early 20th century, and specifically how the samurai became the dominant symbol of Japan. Um, in this first image, commemorating the Japanese seizure of Port Arthur from the Russians, Japan is depicted as a woman in some kind of indeterminate Orientalist garments holding a samurai sword. Um, we see the rising sun in the background. The image is very heroic. A similar positive theme is seen later in the year after the Russo-Japanese War, with British and Japanese troops shaking hands and declaring their alliance. I mean, the Japanese soldier seems to be holding a laurel victory wreath and wearing medals. I mean, there's no obvious samurai imagery here. A somewhat more negative image of Japan, this time very much as a samurai, can be seen in the context of 1910 trade issues. The samurai theme continues in 1918, with Japan still a close ally, stopping Wilhelm II going to Vladivostok. By 1928, with the Anglo-Japanese alliance a thing of the past, and tensions over Japan's involvement in China, the negative samurai image is firmly established to symbolize Japan. The caption to this piece is, the Japanese rush in where devils fear to tread, as the samurai challenges the dragon symbolizing nationalist China. This print from 1933 shows Japan as a samurai, with a small child representing the puppet state of Manchukuo, with the League of Nations as an ineffective dove sitting in the tree. The samurai and dragon theme became common in the 1930s, as in this image showing Japan about to cut China's foreign ties. And in 1937, the samurai has cut off the tail of the Chinese dragon, labeled Manchukuo, and again mentions the ineffectiveness of the League of Nations. Later that same year, the Soviet bear watches Japan and China in a macabre dance and wants to get involved. This kind of 1939 comic shows John Bull at a table with papers concerning the Tianjin incident, in which Japanese troops blockaded British settlements. John Bull complains about his samurai counterpart jumping around on the table as he is trying to have a discussion. Finally, this comic from 1942 shows the American eagle attacking the Japanese samurai in his ship. And, as the series of comics shows, Japan was not the only country to be portrayed as a specific icon, the Chinese dragon, a Russian bear, an American eagle, and others also featuring. But in this context, it's important to note the chronology by which the samurai became the symbol of Japan. In the late 19th century, Japan is often represented by the Meiji Emperor or some other symbols. But then this continues into the early 20th century, certainly until the emperor's death in 1912. Other images include modern soldiers. We saw that woman at the very start. And the samurai only really became firmly established in British iconography of Japan after the Russo Japanese War, and then especially after the First World War. Now, two other countries that are very useful to look at, which I won't, in the context of the samurai image in Europe, are Germany and Italy, both of which had shifting relations with Japan before their alliance in the Second World War. And again, I'm not going into detail here. There's a great deal of existing work, some excellent scholarship out there. But I'd just like to show a couple of representative images. This first one from 1936, we see a German knight on the left in a modern kind of steel helmet, standing along a Japanese samurai, fending off the giant Comintern serpent with the words, "Not to cross our threshold." Um, and this second image, which is more dramatic, was made by the Italian poster designer Gino Boccasile in 1942, showing a giant samurai smashing British and American ships. Now, both of these images show some of the ways in which Japan was portrayed in Germany and Italy, and the samurai themes in much of the work from this time are much more dramatic and explicit than most of what I've seen produced in Japan. I would suggest anyone interested in the samurai image in Germany and Italy, I would direct you towards the excellent work, recent and forthcoming work in this area by scholars such as Michele Monserrati, Sarah Panzer, and Hans Joachim Biba. And now to conclude, I've tried to show here that the samurai and Bushido were very influential in how Japan was seen around the world in the period between the 1890s and the Second World War. At the same time, the samurai were not necessarily widely known outside of Japan at the beginning of this period, and only evolved into a symbol of Japan over the course of the early 20th century. With regard to the samurai, they had been abolished several decades before this process began, and with regard to Bushido, as a supposedly historical ethic with no concrete roots or accepted doctrine, it was very open to interpretation to almost any ends. On the one hand, this flexibility has given it great resilience, as the lack of firm historical roots means that there's nothing solid at the base, which could be definitively refuted. And I assume that we'll continue to see cycles of growth and decline in interest in both Bushido and the samurai in the future, both in Japan and in other countries. And in my experience, this will often reveal a great deal more about the social and historical context in which this occurs than it will about the samurai or traditional Japanese culture. So thank you very much. I will leave it there. There's a few references here, which I think would be in the recorded version as well. So if you don't get them, but you're also very welcome to email me or anything else or ask in the Q&A. So thank you.